You're sitting there right now, maybe in your car after work, maybe late at night scrolling through your phone, and there's this weight pressing down on your chest that you can't quite name. You've achieved things, you've checked boxes, you've hustled, grinded, pushed through. But somewhere deep inside, there's a voice whispering that something is fundamentally wrong, that you're barely holding it together, and the thought of actually talking to someone about it, of sitting in a therapist's office and admitting you need help, feels like admitting defeat, like you're weak, like you're less of a man. That stigma, that invisible wall between you and the help you desperately need, isn't just uncomfortable. It's killing you. Not metaphorically, literally. You know that feeling when you've done everything right, when you've been considerate and thoughtful and patient, when you've put others first and swallowed your own needs time and again, and yet somehow you're still alone, still unappreciated, still watching others get the respect and connection that seems to elude you, no matter how hard you try. You're tired of being nice because being nice hasn't worked, and that exhaustion runs deeper than you want to admit. You've followed the rules, you've been the good guy, you've avoided conflict and maintained your composure, and the return on that investment has been crushing disappointment. The title of this video asks if you're tired of being nice, and the answer screaming inside you is yes. But what comes after that admission is where most men get lost. This isn't about becoming cruel or abandoning your values. This is about understanding why the frustrated nice guy cycle exists in the first place, why it's a prison of your own construction, and how the ancient wisdom of Stoicism offers you a way out that doesn't require you to betray who you are at your core. The nice guy cycle is one of the most insidious traps modern men fall into, because it masquerades as virtue while actually representing a profound abandonment of authentic selfhood, and breaking free from it requires philosophical courage that our culture has systematically trained you to suppress. Let's start by naming what you're really experiencing, because the frustration you feel isn't irrational or unwarranted. You've been operating under a covert contract, an unspoken agreement you made with the world that said if you were agreeable enough, if you avoided making waves, if you prioritized others' comfort over your own authentic expression, then you would be valued, chosen and loved. This contract was never explicitly stated, but it was taught to you through 1,000 small interactions, through the praise you received for being compliant and the criticism you absorbed when you asserted yourself. You learned that your value was contingent on your usefulness to others, that your worth was measured by how little disruption you caused, and you internalized this so deeply that you began to believe that being nice was your only path to connection. But here's the devastating truth that the Stoics understood millennia ago. Any relationship built on suppression of your authentic self is not a relationship at all, but rather a performance. And performances are exhausting to maintain and ultimately unfulfilling to experience. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that we should not hope for things to happen as we wish, but rather wish for them to happen as they do happen. And this principle cuts directly to the heart of the nice guy dilemma. You have been wishing for the world to recognize your niceness and reward it accordingly. But the world operates according to its own principles, and one of those principles is that people respect authenticity far more than they respect agreeableness. The frustrated nice guy cycle operates like this. You suppress your genuine wants and needs. You overfunction in relationships by anticipating others' desires before they've even expressed them. You avoid conflict at all costs because you've convinced yourself that disagreement equals rejection. And then you build up resentment when the recognition and reciprocity you expected never materializes. This resentment festers beneath your pleasant exterior, occasionally breaking through in passive-aggressive comments or sudden emotional withdrawals that confuse the people around you because they don't align with the persona you've been presenting. You feel entitled to reward for your niceness, and that sense of entitlement is precisely what transforms genuine kindness into a transactional manipulation, even though you never consciously intended it that way. The Stoics had a term for living according to nature, which meant aligning your actions with reality as it actually is, rather than as you wish it to be. And the nice guy pattern is fundamentally a rejection of this principle because it's built on the fantasy that self-erasure will be rewarded. Epictetus taught his students about the dichotomy of control, the foundational Stoic practice of distinguishing between what is in our power and what is not. And when you examine the nice guy cycle through this lens, you see immediately where the error lies. You cannot control whether others appreciate you, whether they reciprocate your efforts, or whether they choose you for friendship or romance or professional advancement. These outcomes are fundamentally outside your sphere of control. What you can control is your own character, your own choices, your own authenticity, and your own adherence to your values. When you make your well-being contingent on the uncontrollable responses of others, you have guaranteed your own suffering. The critique here must go deeper than simply saying you should be more assertive or that you should stop being nice. The problem isn't niceness itself. Genuine kindness, compassion, and consideration for others are virtues that the Stoics prized highly. The problem is that what you've been calling niceness is actually a sophisticated form of people-pleasing rooted in fear, and fear is the antithesis of virtue. Seneca wrote extensively about the servility of the man who lives to please others, arguing that such a person is a slave to every passing opinion and can never achieve the tranquility that comes from inner self-sufficiency. When you are nice because you fear rejection, you are not being virtuous, you are being strategic, and that strategy is built on a foundation of sand because it places your peace of mind in the hands of others. The hustle culture that dominates modern masculine discourse tells you to optimize yourself, to become more attractive or successful or influential so that you'll finally receive the validation you crave. But this is simply another version of the same external dependency that created the nice guy problem in the first place. Whether you're hustling for achievement or hustling for approval through agreeableness, you're still looking outside yourself for the answer to an internal question. The Stoic critique of this approach is devastating in its clarity. You cannot outsource your sense of self-worth to external circumstances without becoming a perpetual beggar at the door of the world's opinion. Let's talk about what's really happening when you suppress your authentic desires and needs in favor of being agreeable. You are engaging in what philosophers call a betrayal of the self, and this betrayal has cascading consequences that extend far beyond your immediate relationships. When you consistently silence your genuine preferences, you lose touch with what you actually want, to the point where, if someone asks you what you'd like to do or how you really feel, you draw a blank because you've practiced self-suppression for so long that you've become estranged from your own inner life. This is not a small problem. This is the death of agency, the abandonment of the examined life that Socrates insisted was the only life worth living. You cannot know yourself if you will not allow yourself to have and express genuine preferences, and you cannot live a life of integrity if there is no authentic self at the center of your actions. The nice guy pattern creates a hollow man, someone who is so busy managing others' perceptions that he has no energy left for self-development, for genuine connection, or for the cultivation of virtue. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that he was going to die, using memento mori not as a morbid fixation, but as a clarifying principle that helped him distinguish what truly mattered from what was merely urgent or socially expected. When you remember that your time is finite, that you will not get a second chance to live authentically, the nice guy pattern reveals itself as the tragedy it truly is, a systematic waste of your limited time on earth in service of a strategy that doesn't even work. The frustration you feel is actually a healthy signal, a message from your psyche that something is profoundly wrong with how you're operating in the world. The problem is that most men misinterpret this frustration and either double down on the nice guy behavior, trying to be even more accommodating in hopes that eventually it will pay off, or they swing to the opposite extreme and adopt a pose of aggressive indifference that is just as inauthentic as the people-pleasing it replaces. Neither of these responses addresses the root issue, which is that you have not yet developed a stable, internal source of self-worth that is independent of others' responses to you. The Stoic solution to this problem is both simple and demanding. You must learn to find your value in the quality of your character rather than in the outcomes you achieve or the approval you receive. This is what the Stoics meant by living according to virtue, and it's worth unpacking what virtue actually means in this context, because the word has been so diluted in modern usage. Virtue for the Stoics wasn't about sexual purity or religious compliance or even conventional morality in the sense we usually understand it. Virtue was the cultivation of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, the four cardinal virtues that together constituted human excellence. When you live virtuously in this sense, you make decisions based on what is genuinely good rather than what is merely expedient or socially rewarded, and this requires a level of self-knowledge and moral courage that the nice guy pattern actively prevents you from developing. The turning point in breaking the frustrated nice guy cycle comes when you recognize that you have been seeking external validation as a substitute for internal self-respect, and that this substitution is impossible because they are fundamentally different things. External validation is contingent, fleeting, and ultimately unsatisfying because it depends on factors outside your control. Internal self-respect is stable, enduring, and deeply fulfilling because it is grounded in your own assessment of whether you are living according to your values. Epictetus taught that the key to freedom is learning to desire only what is in your power, and this principle is revolutionary when applied to the nice guy dilemma. If you can learn to desire self-respect more than you desire approval, to prefer authenticity over agreeableness, to value your own integrity more than others' comfort, you will have escaped the prison you've been living in. This doesn't mean you become selfish or indifferent to others. It means you recognize that genuine connection is only possible between two people who are both showing up authentically, and that by suppressing yourself, you are actually preventing real intimacy even as you're trying to create it. The nice guy believes that if he reveals his genuine wants and needs, he will be rejected, and this belief creates a self-fulfilling prophecy because the persona he presents is so bland and deferential that it inspires neither passion nor respect. What if you were rejected for who you actually are? At least then you would know that the rejection was of you rather than of the carefully constructed facade you've been maintaining, and you could move on to find people who actually appreciate your authentic self. The philosophical framework that makes this shift possible is the Stoic concept of autarkia, or self-sufficiency. This doesn't mean isolating yourself or pretending you don't need others. Human beings are social creatures, and the Stoics recognized that we are meant to live in community and that many of our duties arise from our relationships with others. What autarkia means is that your fundamental well-being, your inner tranquility, cannot be dependent on things outside your control. You can enjoy relationships, you can value connection, you can work to be a good friend and partner and colleague, but your sense of self-worth must be rooted in your own character and choices rather than in others' responses to you. This is the difference between wanting connection and needing validation. When you want connection, you can be genuine and vulnerable and authentic because you're not operating from a position of desperation. When you need validation, you will twist yourself into whatever shape you think will earn it, and this contortion is both visible to others and corrosive to your own soul. The nice guy is always coming from a place of need, and people can sense this neediness even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. It manifests as a kind of over-eagerness, a willingness to abandon your own preferences too quickly, an inability to disagree without becoming either defensive or deferential. These are the signs of someone who has not yet developed the internal stability that comes from self-respect. One of the most pernicious aspects of the nice guy pattern is that it often develops as a response to genuine trauma or adversity in childhood. Perhaps you grew up in a household where conflict was dangerous, where asserting yourself led to emotional abandonment or punishment, where the only way to feel safe was to become invisible and compliant. If this was your experience, then the nice guy pattern was actually an intelligent adaptation to a difficult environment, a survival strategy that helped you navigate circumstances where you had very little power. The problem is that you're no longer in that environment, and the strategy that once protected you is now limiting you, preventing you from forming the kind of deep connections and achieving the kind of authentic success that would actually fulfill you. Recognizing this requires what philosophers call perspective taking, the ability to step back from your immediate experience and see it in a broader context. The Stoics practiced this through regular contemplation and self-examination, asking themselves whether their automatic responses were serving them or whether they were simply repeating patterns they had learned in the past. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to examine his own judgments and reactions, to ask whether the interpretations he was placing on events were accurate or whether he was being governed by old fears and habits. This kind of radical self-honesty is difficult, but it is absolutely necessary if you want to break free from the nice guy cycle. Let's address the anger and resentment that comes with being trapped in this pattern, because these emotions are significant and they need to be understood rather than suppressed or acted out. You feel angry because you've been playing by rules that you thought were agreed upon, and it turns out that no one else was following those rules or even aware they existed. You feel resentful because you've sacrificed your own needs repeatedly, and the recognition and reciprocity you expected in return never materialized. These feelings are understandable, but acting from them will only perpetuate your suffering. The Stoics distinguished between the initial impression or emotion that arises automatically and the judgment or assent that you give to that impression, and this distinction is crucial here. You cannot prevent the automatic feeling of frustration or anger when you realize how much you've suppressed yourself, but you can choose whether to indulge that anger, to build a narrative around it, to use it as justification for bitterness or retaliation. Seneca wrote extensively about anger, calling it a temporary madness that clouds judgment and leads to actions you will later regret. The antidote to anger is not suppression, but understanding. When you understand that the nice guy pattern was your choice, even if it was a choice made unconsciously in response to circumstances beyond your control, you can take responsibility for changing it rather than blaming others for not rewarding behavior they never asked for. This is a harsh truth, but it is also a liberating one, because it means you have the power to change your situation by changing your approach. The shift from frustrated nice guy to authentic man requires you to develop what the Stoics called prohairesis, which can be translated as moral character or the faculty of choice. This is your capacity to make decisions based on reason and values rather than on impulse or social conditioning. The nice guy operates on autopilot, automatically suppressing himself and agreeing with others because that's what he's always done, and because the thought of doing otherwise triggers intense anxiety. To break this pattern, you must learn to pause between stimulus and response, to create a space where you can consciously choose how to act rather than simply reacting according to your conditioning. This is difficult work because it requires you to tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty and the anxiety of potential rejection. When someone asks your opinion and your automatic response is to defer or to try to figure out what they want to hear, you must learn to pause, to check in with yourself, to ask what you actually think, and then to share that authentically. This will feel vulnerable and frightening at first, because you're violating a pattern that has been keeping you feeling safe, even if that safety was ultimately illusory. The Stoics would tell you that this discomfort is the price of freedom. that you cannot become who you're capable of being without passing through the fire of transformation. There is a specific kind of courage required to stop being nice in the sense we've been discussing. And it's worth distinguishing this from other forms of courage that our culture celebrates more readily. It's not the courage of physical bravery, or the courage of taking entrepreneurial risks, or the courage of pursuing ambitious goals. It's the courage of vulnerability, the courage to be seen as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be, the courage to risk rejection in pursuit of genuine connection. Brené Brown has done extensive research on vulnerability in contemporary psychology, but the philosophical roots of this insight go back much further. The Stoics understood that living according to nature, according to your true self, requires tremendous courage, precisely because it means releasing your grip on outcomes you cannot control. When you decide to stop people-pleasing and start being authentic, you are accepting that some people will not like you, that some relationships will end, that you will lose the shallow approval you've been receiving in exchange for the possibility of deeper connection with people who appreciate who you actually are. This is a trade you should be willing to make, but making it requires you to believe that your authentic self is worth showing. And this is where many men get stuck, because years of self-suppression have left them uncertain about whether they even have an authentic self to show. The practical work of breaking the nice guy cycle begins with awareness, with learning to notice when you're automatically suppressing yourself or deferring to others out of habit rather than genuine choice. This is where the Stoic practice of prosauche, or attention, becomes invaluable. Throughout your day, you need to be paying attention to your own internal experience, noticing when you feel the impulse to agree even though you disagree, when you find yourself saying yes when you want to say no, when you start to contort your genuine opinion to match what you think someone wants to hear. This kind of self-monitoring is exhausting at first because you're interrupting patterns that have been running automatically for years or even decades, but it becomes easier with practice. The goal is not to judge yourself harshly when you notice yourself falling into the pattern, but simply to observe it with curiosity and then to make a different choice going forward. The Stoics emphasize the importance of daily reflection, and you would benefit from establishing a practice of reviewing your day each evening, asking yourself where you showed up authentically and where you suppressed yourself, what fears drove your choices, and what you might do differently tomorrow. This kind of self-examination is the foundation of all personal growth, and it's impossible to change patterns you're not aware of. The next step is learning to articulate your genuine preferences and needs, and this is more difficult than it sounds if you've spent years suppressing them. You may find that you genuinely don't know what you want in many situations because you've trained yourself not to have preferences. The way to rebuild this capacity is to start small, with low-stakes situations where the consequences of authentic expression are minimal. When a friend asks where you want to eat, instead of immediately deferring or saying you don't care, pause and actually check in with yourself about what sounds good. When a colleague asks your opinion on a project, instead of trying to figure out what they want to hear, share your actual assessment. When someone makes a request of your time, instead of automatically saying yes, pause and consider whether you genuinely want to do what they're asking or whether you're agreeing out of obligation or fear of rejection. This rebuilding of your capacity for authentic preference is like strengthening a muscle that has atrophied from disuse. It will be uncomfortable at first, and you will sometimes overcompensate by being too rigid or oppositional as you're learning to find the balance. But this discomfort is necessary. The Stoics would frame this as practicing virtue, as learning to act with wisdom and justice and courage rather than simply reacting according to conditioned patterns. A crucial distinction to understand is the difference between authentic kindness and people-pleasing. Authentic kindness comes from a place of abundance and genuine care for others. It is freely chosen. It is not contingent on receiving anything in return. and it does not leave you feeling resentful or depleted. People-pleasing, by contrast, comes from a place of fear and scarcity. It is not freely chosen, but rather compelled by anxiety about rejection or abandonment. It is absolutely contingent on receiving validation or approval in return, even if this expectation is unconscious. And it inevitably leads to resentment because the covert contract at its heart is never fulfilled to your satisfaction. The Stoics would say that authentic kindness is an expression of virtue, while people-pleasing is a form of vice because it is rooted in fear rather than in reason and genuine concern for others. When you act from authentic kindness, you can be generous without keeping score, you can help others without expecting reciprocity, and you can maintain your boundaries without guilt because you're acting from a place of choice rather than compulsion. This is the kind of goodness worth cultivating, and it is only possible when you have developed the self-respect that allows you to choose generosity rather than feeling forced into it. The boundary work required to break the nice guy pattern is some of the most challenging interpersonal work you will ever do, particularly if you're surrounded by people who have become accustomed to your pattern of over-functioning and self-suppression. When you start to establish boundaries, to say no when you previously would have said yes, to express disagreement when you previously would have gone along, the people around you will resist because you're changing the unspoken rules of your relationships. This resistance may take the form of anger, of guilt-tripping, of accusations that you've changed or become selfish, and you must be prepared for this without letting it derail your progress. The Stoic principle of the dichotomy of control is essential here. You cannot control how others respond to your boundaries. You can only control whether you maintain them. Some relationships will not survive your decision to stop people-pleasing, and this is actually valuable information because it tells you that those relationships were based on your self-suppression rather than on genuine mutual regard. The people who truly care about you will adjust to your new boundaries and will likely respect you more for having them, even if there's an initial period of discomfort. The people who can't accept your boundaries were never invested in your well-being in the first place, and losing these relationships, while painful, creates space for healthier connections. There is a specific trap that many men fall into when they first start trying to break the nice guy pattern, and it's worth addressing explicitly. The trap is swinging to the opposite extreme, adopting a pose of aggressive indifference or adopting ideologies that frame all consideration for others as weakness. This is not the solution. This is simply trading one form of inauthenticity for another, replacing the nice guy mask with the tough guy mask, and it is equally limiting and equally unsatisfying. The Stoics emphasize the importance of finding the mean between extremes, what Aristotle in his ethical writings called the golden mean. The goal is not to become indifferent or selfish, but to become authentic and boundaried. You want to be kind without being a pushover, generous without being a martyr, strong without being rigid, assertive without being aggressive. This balance is difficult to achieve and requires constant calibration, but it is the only path to the kind of integrated masculinity that will actually fulfill you. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of being like a rock against which the waves constantly crash, but which remains unmoved. And this is a useful metaphor for the kind of grounded authenticity you're aiming for. You want to be responsive to others without being controlled by their reactions, connected without being enmeshed, independent without being isolated. Let's talk about the role of anger in this transformation, because anger is often the emotion that finally gives men the energy to break out of the nice guy pattern. You've been suppressing yourself for so long, swallowing your frustration and disappointment, and eventually that suppressed anger reaches a critical mass and erupts. This can be the catalyst for change, but it can also lead you astray if you're not careful. Anger has a clarifying quality. It cuts through the fog of rationalization and excuse-making and forces you to confront the reality of your situation. But anger also distorts perception. It makes you see enemies where there are only people acting according to their own interests and conditioning, and it can lead you to burn bridges and make declarations that your wiser self would not endorse. The Stoic approach to anger, as articulated by Seneca, is to recognize it as a natural response, but not to indulge it or act from it. When you feel the surge of anger at how you've been taken for granted or how your niceness has been exploited, acknowledge that feeling. Understand what it's telling you about boundaries you need to set and patterns you need to change, but then let it pass through you rather than building a whole identity around it. The bitter, resentful ex-nice guy is not an improvement over the frustrated nice guy. He's just a different form of suffering. The goal is to move through anger toward wisdom, to use the energy of your frustration to fuel genuine change rather than to justify cruelty or withdrawal. The practical steps for breaking the cycle require daily practice of new behaviors, and this is where the Stoic emphasis on habit formation becomes essential. Aristotle wrote that we are what we repeatedly do, and the nice guy pattern is a set of habits that have been reinforced over thousands of iterations. To change this, you need to establish new habits that reflect the authentic self you're trying to embody. Start with small daily practices. Each morning, set an intention to be authentic in at least one interaction that day. When you catch yourself about to suppress your genuine opinion, pause and choose to express it instead, even if your voice shakes, and even if you're not sure how it will be received. When someone makes a request of your time or energy, practice the pause before automatically agreeing, asking yourself whether this is something you genuinely want to do, or whether you're acting from obligation or fear. Keep a journal where you track these moments of authentic expression and notice how you feel afterward, not just in terms of others' responses, but in terms of your own sense of integrity and self-respect. The Stoics kept philosophical journals precisely for this purpose, to track their progress in living according to virtue and to identify patterns where they were falling short. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is essentially his personal journal of self-examination, and while your journal doesn't need to achieve that level of philosophical sophistication, the practice of regular self-reflection is invaluable. You also need to develop what we might call a philosophy of authentic engagement, a set of principles that guide how you show up in relationships and interactions. This might include commitments like, I will express my genuine preferences even when I'm uncertain how they'll be received. I will disagree when I actually disagree rather than pretending to agree for the sake of harmony. I will say no to requests that I don't have the time or energy to fulfill rather than overcommitting and then resenting it. I will ask for what I need, rather than expecting others to read my mind or reward my unstated sacrifices. I will accept that some people will not like me, and that this is the price of authenticity rather than a referendum on my worth. These principles need to be written down, reviewed regularly, and consciously practiced until they become second nature. The Stoics understood that virtue is not something you possess, but something you practice, and this is especially true of the virtues of authenticity and courage that are required to break the nice guy pattern. You will fail at this practice regularly. You will find yourself falling back into old patterns of self-suppression and people-pleasing, and this is normal and expected. The key is to notice when you've fallen back, to understand what triggered the old pattern, and to choose differently the next time without berating yourself for the failure. The concept of memento mori, the Stoic practice of remembering that you will die, is particularly relevant to breaking the nice guy cycle, because it provides perspective on what actually matters in your limited time on Earth. When you remember that your life is finite, that you have only so many years or decades left to live, the nice guy pattern reveals itself as a tragic waste of your precious time. You are spending your one irreplaceable life, suppressing your authentic self in hopes of earning approval from people who will likely forget you shortly after you die. This is not meant to be morbid, but rather clarifying. When you truly internalize the reality of your mortality, you recognize that authenticity is not a luxury, but a necessity, that you cannot afford to waste your time being someone you're not, that the risk of rejection is insignificant compared to the certainty of regret if you never allow yourself to be truly known. The nice guy is living as if he has infinite time to finally start being himself, as if there will always be a later moment when he'll finally take the risk of authenticity. But there is no such moment unless you create it, and every day you delay is a day of your actual life that you have spent in self-imposed exile from your genuine self. The relationship between the nice guy pattern and masculine identity deserves particular attention because much of the confusion men experience around this issue stems from conflicting messages about what masculinity should look like. On one hand, you've been told that being sensitive and emotionally available and considerate is what women want and what will make you successful in modern relationships. On the other hand, you've observed that these qualities alone don't seem to generate attraction or respect unless they're combined with something else, something harder to define, but related to boundaries and self-possession and the capacity to stand firm in your own truth. The nice guy takes the first message and runs with it to an extreme, suppressing all assertiveness and all capacity for healthy conflict in an attempt to be maximally safe and accommodating. But this creates a kind of masculine void, a sense that there's no solid center to you, that you could be pushed in any direction by whoever applies sufficient social pressure. The authentic alternative is what might be called integrated masculinity, where you're capable of both strength and tenderness, both assertion and flexibility, both independence and connection. You can be caring without being self-sacrificing, strong without being domineering, confident without being arrogant. This integration is only possible when you've done the difficult internal work of developing self-respect, independent of external validation. Let's address the specific challenge of applying these principles in romantic relationships, because this is often where the nice guy pattern causes the most suffering and confusion. You've been taught that if you're respectful and considerate and emotionally available, women will be attracted to you, but then you find yourself perpetually in the friend zone or in relationships where you're not truly desired. This creates enormous frustration and resentment, and it leads many men to conclude that women say they want nice guys, but actually want something else. This interpretation contains a grain of truth but misses the deeper issue. Women, like all humans, are attracted to authenticity and self-possession. The nice guy is not actually being respectful, he's being strategic, managing his behavior to avoid rejection, and this creates an undercurrent of inauthenticity that undermines attraction even when the surface behaviors seem correct. Real respect includes respecting yourself enough to have boundaries, to express disagreement, to maintain your own life and interests, rather than making someone else the center of your world. Real emotional availability includes the vulnerability of sharing your actual thoughts and feelings, including the ones that might not be well received, rather than just mirroring back what you think the other person wants to hear. The nice guy thinks he's being respectful, but he's actually being patronizing because he's assuming the other person can't handle his authentic self. He thinks he's being considerate, but he's actually being manipulative because he's over-functioning in hopes of creating obligation. When you shift to authentic engagement, you become genuinely attractive because you're showing up as a whole person rather than as a carefully managed persona. The Stoic concept of amor fati, love of fate, is useful here because it helps you reframe rejection and failure not as catastrophes to be avoided at all costs, but as necessary feedback that helps you find the right people and situations. The nice guy lives in terror of rejection and therefore contorts himself to be acceptable to everyone, which paradoxically makes him attractive to no one. When you embrace amor fati, you recognize that being rejected for your authentic self is actually a gift because it saves you from wasting time in relationships that would never fulfill you. Every no you receive is directing you toward the yes that actually matters. And you can only find that meaningful yes by being willing to risk the no's. This requires a fundamental shift in your relationship to outcome, from needing every interaction to validate you toward trusting that if you consistently show up authentically, you will find your people. This trust is not naive optimism, but rather philosophical conviction grounded in the understanding that you cannot control others' responses, but you can control your own integrity, and that maintaining your integrity is the only path to a life you won't regret. The journey from frustrated nice guy to authentic man is not a one-time transformation, but an ongoing practice that will require vigilance and commitment for the rest of your life. The pull to slip back into people-pleasing, to avoid conflict, to suppress yourself in hopes of earning approval, will remain strong because these patterns are deeply ingrained and because they offer the seductive illusion of safety. What makes ongoing practice possible is developing the visceral understanding that the safety the nice guy pattern promises is false, that the rejection you're trying to avoid is already happening in a different form, that by suppressing yourself, you are rejecting yourself more thoroughly than anyone else could. The path forward requires you to become your own source of validation, to develop the capacity to look at yourself in the mirror and feel genuine self-respect regardless of how others are responding to you. This doesn't happen through affirmations or positive thinking, but through action, through the daily practice of making choices aligned with your values rather than with your fears. Through the accumulation of moments where you chose authenticity over safety, truth over comfort, integrity over approval. The Stoic exercises that support this transformation include the premeditation of adversity, where you deliberately imagine the worst-case scenarios you're afraid of and work through how you would handle them, thereby reducing their power over you. If your fear is that expressing your genuine opinion will lead to rejection, spend time vividly imagining being rejected and then asking yourself what you would do next, how you would handle it, whether it would actually be the catastrophe you've been treating it as. Almost always, you'll find that the imagined catastrophe is survivable and that your resilience is greater than you've been giving yourself credit for. The Stoics also practiced voluntary discomfort, deliberately putting themselves in challenging situations to build their capacity to handle difficulty. And you can apply this by intentionally placing yourself in situations where you'll need to be authentic even though it's uncomfortable. This might mean initiating a difficult conversation you've been avoiding, setting a boundary you know will be challenged, or expressing a preference in a situation where you'd normally defer. Each time you do this and survive the discomfort, you build evidence for yourself that authenticity is not only possible, but actually feels better than the cramped constraint of the nice guy pattern. The role of community and accountability in this transformation cannot be overstated. You need to surround yourself with men who are also doing this work, who will call you out when you're falling back into people-pleasing patterns and who will encourage you when you're taking authentic risks. This might be a men's group, a close friend who understands what you're working on, or a therapist who can provide professional guidance and support. The nice guy pattern thrives in isolation, in the false belief that you're the only one struggling with this and that everyone else has it figured out. Community breaks this isolation and provides both accountability and modeling of what authentic masculinity looks like. The Stoics emphasize the importance of having philosophical companions, people who were committed to the same path of development and who could support each other in living according to virtue. You need your own version of this, a circle of people who value authenticity and growth over image management, and who will support you in becoming who you're capable of being, rather than enabling you to stay who you've been. There will be losses on this journey, and it's important to acknowledge and grieve them rather than pretending they don't matter. You will lose relationships that were based on your self-suppression. You will lose the comfortable, if ultimately unsatisfying dynamic, where you knew your role and knew what was expected of you. You will lose the fantasy that if you just found the right technique or said the right thing, everyone would finally appreciate you. These losses are real, and pretending they're not or rushing past them will undermine your progress. The Stoic approach to loss is not to deny its reality, but to see it clearly, and to recognize that clinging to what's already gone only extends your suffering. When a relationship ends because you established boundaries, grieve the relationship, but also recognize that you've gained something more valuable, your self-respect. When you lose the approval of someone who only liked you because you were endlessly accommodating, feel the sting of that rejection, but also recognize that their approval was conditional and therefore ultimately worthless as a foundation for genuine connection. The losses clear space for something better, for relationships based on mutual respect and authentic regard, rather than on your strategic self-suppression. The integration of Stoic philosophy with modern psychological understanding of attachment and trauma provides a more complete picture of why the nice guy pattern develops and how to address it effectively. If you developed an anxious attachment style in childhood, where your caregiver's love felt conditional and unpredictable, you learned to constantly monitor others' emotional states and to contort yourself to maintain connection. The nice guy pattern is often an adult manifestation of this childhood adaptation, and understanding this can help you have compassion for yourself even as you work to change the pattern. The Stoics would say that while your past conditioning influenced you, it does not determine you, and that at any moment you have the capacity to choose differently based on reason rather than reacting according to old patterns. This is the essence of human freedom, as the Stoics understood it, not freedom from external constraints, which are largely beyond our control, but freedom in how we respond to those constraints, freedom to choose our judgments and values, regardless of what circumstances or conditioning would push us toward. The question of anger and resentment toward women specifically requires direct address, because this is where many men who are breaking free from the nice guy pattern get derailed into ideologies that are ultimately destructive. If you find yourself developing generalized anger toward women, blaming them for not rewarding your niceness or for being attracted to traits you don't possess, you have missed the point entirely. Women are not a monolithic group conspiring against you. They are individual human beings responding to the signals you're sending, and the signals the nice guy sends are confusing and inauthentic. The resentment you feel is not actually about women, but about yourself, about the years you spent betraying your authentic self in a strategy that didn't work, and you're projecting that self-anger outward because it's less painful than taking full responsibility. The Stoic practice here is to bring your attention back to what is in your control. Not how women respond to you, but how you show up, whether you're being authentic, whether you're living according to your values. When you make this shift, when you take full ownership of your own development without blaming others for not responding the way you hoped, you reclaim your power and you become genuinely attractive in a way the nice guy never can be. The practical work of developing emotional literacy is essential for men breaking free from the nice guy pattern, because part of what keeps you trapped is the inability to identify and articulate your own emotional experience. You've learned to suppress emotions that feel dangerous, particularly anger and sadness and fear, and to present a facade of pleasant agreeability regardless of your inner state. This emotional suppression doesn't make the emotions go away, it just drives them underground, where they manifest as passive aggression, sudden withdrawals, physical symptoms, or explosive outbursts that seem to come from nowhere. Learning to identify what you're actually feeling in real time is a skill that must be developed through practice. Throughout your day, pause regularly and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Not what should I be feeling or what would be appropriate to feel, but what is the actual emotional experience in my body? You might notice tension in your shoulders that signals suppressed anger, or a tightness in your chest that signals anxiety, or a heaviness that signals sadness. The Stoics emphasized the importance of examining your impressions, the automatic thoughts and feelings that arise. And this examination is only possible if you're paying attention to your inner experience rather than constantly monitoring external reactions. Once you can identify your emotions, the next skill is learning to express them appropriately. And this is where many men stumble because you've had so little practice with healthy emotional expression. The nice guy pattern involves either complete suppression or, when the pressure becomes too great, inappropriate explosion, but neither of these is effective communication. Learning to express emotions skillfully means being able to say things like, "I'm feeling frustrated right now because I agreed to something I didn't actually want to do," or "I notice I'm feeling anxious about this conversation and I need a moment before we continue," or "I'm angry about what just happened and I need to talk about it," rather than pretending everything is fine. This kind of direct emotional communication feels incredibly vulnerable at first, and you'll worry that expressing negative emotions will drive people away. But the opposite is actually true. Appropriate emotional expression creates intimacy and trust because it signals that you're a real person with a real inner life rather than a pleasant automaton. The key is that this expression must be authentic rather than manipulative, sharing your experience rather than weaponizing your emotions to control others' behavior. The Stoic distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us becomes especially important when dealing with the outcomes of authentic expression. When you start setting boundaries and expressing genuine preferences and disagreeing when you actually disagree, some people will respond negatively. They may become angry, they may withdraw, they may try to guilt you back into your old patterns. These responses are not up to you. What is up to you is whether you maintain your boundaries despite these responses, whether you stay grounded in your own values rather than being blown about by others' reactions. Epictetus taught that other people's opinions of you are not your concern, that you cannot control what others think or feel about you, and that attempting to do so is a guaranteed path to misery. When someone responds negatively to your authenticity, the nice guy in you will want to immediately backtrack, to apologize, to return to people-pleasing, to restore the relationship to its previous state. But this is the crucial moment where you must hold firm, recognizing that their discomfort with your boundaries is information about them rather than evidence that you're doing something wrong. People who genuinely care about your well-being will adjust to your boundaries even if there's an initial period of friction. People who only valued you for your self-suppression will exit your life, and as painful as this is, it's ultimately a gift. The practical challenge of applying these principles in the workplace deserves specific attention because professional environments often reward the appearance of agreeability and punish direct authenticity. The nice guy at work is the person who never pushes back on unrealistic deadlines, who takes on extra work without negotiating for additional compensation or support, who sits silently in meetings even when he disagrees with the direction being proposed, who allows his ideas to be stolen or his contributions to go unrecognized. This pattern is just as destructive professionally as it is personally, leading to burnout, resentment, stagnation, and a career that never quite reflects your actual capabilities. Breaking this pattern at work requires calibrated assertiveness, learning to advocate for yourself, to negotiate for what you deserve, to push back on unreasonable requests, to claim credit for your contributions, to express dissenting opinions in meetings. This is risky because there are real professional consequences possible, but the alternative is a career spent in frustration and underachievement. The Stoic approach here is to recognize that you cannot control whether assertiveness leads to advancement or termination, but you can control whether you maintain your integrity and self-respect in how you conduct yourself professionally. Sometimes the consequence of authenticity is that you discover your current workplace is not a good fit. And this discovery, while painful, allows you to find an environment where your genuine contributions are actually valued. Let's talk about the specific challenge of breaking the nice guy pattern in long-term relationships or marriages, because this is perhaps the most difficult context for change. If you've been in a relationship for years, operating according to the nice guy pattern, your partner has adapted to this dynamic and may have built their own patterns around your self-suppression. When you suddenly start expressing genuine preferences, setting boundaries, disagreeing and asking for what you need, it will disrupt the equilibrium of the relationship, and this disruption will be uncomfortable for both of you. Your partner may interpret your changes as you becoming selfish or as evidence that you're preparing to leave the relationship. They may resist your new boundaries and try to pull you back into old patterns. This is where you need both courage and patience, maintaining your commitment to authenticity while also communicating clearly about what you're doing and why. You might say something like, "I realize I've been suppressing my genuine thoughts and feelings for a long time, and I'm working on being more authentic because I want us to have a relationship based on both of us showing up as we really are. This may be uncomfortable as we adjust, but I believe it will ultimately make our relationship stronger and more genuine." Some relationships will not survive this transition, and this is heartbreaking, but also informative, telling you that the relationship was based on your self-suppression rather than on genuine mutual regard. Many relationships, however, will actually improve once you move through the initial discomfort, becoming more vital and intimate because both people are finally being authentic. The integration of these Stoic principles with practical action steps creates a comprehensive framework for breaking the nice guy cycle. Each morning, practice the Stoic exercise of premeditatio malorum, imagining the difficulties you might face that day and how you will respond to them with virtue rather than with people-pleasing. Throughout the day, practice prososh, maintaining attention to your own inner experience and noticing when you're about to suppress yourself automatically. When you catch yourself in the pattern, pause and make a different choice. Each evening, practice the Stoic examination of conscience, reviewing your day and asking where you showed up authentically and where you fell back into old patterns, not to judge yourself harshly, but to learn and adjust. Over time, these practices will rewire your automatic responses, creating new neural pathways that support authenticity rather than self-suppression. The change will not be linear. You will have days where you feel like you've mastered this, and days where you slide completely back into old patterns. This is normal and expected. The path of virtue is a practice, not a destination, and the Stoics understood that we are constantly in the process of becoming, rather than ever arriving at some final state of completion. The question of how to handle the loneliness that may come when you first start breaking the nice guy pattern is significant because you're likely to lose some relationships and you haven't yet built new ones based on your authentic self. This transitional period can be profoundly lonely, and it's important to have strategies for managing this loneliness without retreating back into people-pleasing. The Stoic approach to loneliness emphasizes the distinction between being alone and being lonely, recognizing that solitude can be an opportunity for self-development and reflection rather than something to be feared. Seneca wrote extensively about the value of solitude for philosophical development, arguing that time alone allows you to examine your own thoughts and values without the distraction of social performance. When you find yourself alone after breaking free from the nice guy pattern, you can use this time to deepen your relationship with yourself, to pursue interests and projects you've been neglecting, to read and learn and grow in ways that will make you a more interesting and authentic person. This is not resignation to permanent isolation, but rather an investment in becoming someone who can form genuine connections rather than shallow affiliations based on self-suppression. The role of masculine initiation and mentorship in this process is worth considering because in traditional societies, Young men went through formal processes of initiation that taught them how to be men, how to balance strength and compassion, how to stand firm in their truth while still being part of community. Modern Western society largely lacks these formal initiations, and many men are therefore left to figure out masculinity on their own, often defaulting either to the nice guy pattern or to its toxic opposite. If you can find mentors, older men who embody integrated masculinity and who can guide you through this transition, you will find the journey much easier. These mentors can provide perspective when you're struggling, can share their own experiences of breaking similar patterns, and can model what authentic masculinity looks like in practice. If such mentors are not available in your immediate environment, you can find them through men's groups, through therapeutic relationships, or through the careful study of men throughout history who embodied the qualities you aspire to develop. The Stoics themselves serve as mentors across millennia, their writings providing guidance on how to live with integrity and virtue regardless of external circumstances. The practical steps for rebuilding your social life on a foundation of authenticity rather than people-pleasing require intentionality and patience. You cannot simply stop people-pleasing and expect new, authentic relationships to materialize automatically. You need to actively create opportunities for genuine connection by pursuing activities and communities that align with your actual interests rather than with what you think will be socially advantageous. If you're genuinely interested in philosophy, join a philosophy reading group rather than forcing yourself to go to bars or social events you don't actually enjoy. If you care about fitness, find a gym community or sports team where you can connect with others who share that value. The goal is to put yourself in environments where you can be authentic from the start, rather than building relationships on a foundation of performance that you'll later have to dismantle. When you meet new people in these contexts, practice radical authenticity from the first interaction. Share your genuine opinions, express your actual preferences, disagree when you disagree, and see who responds positively to your authentic self. These are your people, the ones who appreciate who you actually are, rather than who you pretend to be. The concept of virtue as sufficient for eudaimonia, or human flourishing, is central to Stoic philosophy and directly relevant to breaking the nice guy pattern. The Stoics argued that external goods like wealth, status, and others' approval are not truly good because they are outside your control and therefore cannot be the foundation for lasting well-being. The only true good is virtue, living according to reason, acting with wisdom and justice and courage and temperance. When you internalize this principle, you realize that your well-being does not depend on whether others approve of you or reciprocate your efforts. Your well-being depends on whether you are living according to your own values, whether you are being authentic and courageous and honest in your dealings with yourself and others. This is a radical reorientation of your value system, and it takes time to truly internalize because our culture constantly reinforces the opposite message, that your worth is determined by external achievement and social validation. But once you genuinely believe that virtue is sufficient for flourishing, you become unshakable because no one can take your virtue away from you. It is the one thing that is entirely within your control. The relationship between the nice guy pattern and imposter syndrome is worth examining because they often co-occur and reinforce each other. Imposter syndrome is the feeling that you're a fraud, that your success is undeserved, that at any moment you'll be exposed as not actually being as competent or worthy as people think you are. The nice guy pattern exacerbates this feeling because when you're constantly performing rather than being authentic, you know on some level that people are responding to a persona rather than to your genuine self. And this creates a pervasive sense of fraudulence. You feel like an imposter because you are being one, presenting a carefully curated version of yourself rather than your genuine complexity. Breaking the nice guy pattern simultaneously addresses imposter syndrome Because when you show up authentically, including showing your vulnerabilities and uncertainties, and areas where you're still learning, you no longer have the disconnect between who you are and who you're presenting yourself to be. The approval you receive for your authentic self feels real in a way that approval of your persona never could, and this begins to build genuine self-confidence rather than the fragile pseudo-confidence that depends on maintaining a perfect image. The Stoic practice of contemplating role models and philosophical heroes provides a useful tool for the journey out of the nice guy pattern. Marcus Aurelius began his meditations with a chapter cataloging the virtues he observed in the people around him, what he learned from his teachers and family members and colleagues about how to live well. You can create your own version of this, identifying men who embody the integrated masculinity you aspire to and studying specifically what makes them different from the nice guy pattern. These role models might be people you know personally, historical figures, or even fictional characters who demonstrate the balance of strength and compassion, assertiveness and flexibility, independence and connection that you're working toward. When you face a difficult situation where your instinct is to fall back into people-pleasing, you can ask yourself what your role model would do in this situation, and this can give you the courage to choose differently. Over time, as you accumulate your own experiences of authentic action, you become your own role model, able to draw on your past successes as evidence that authentic expression is both possible and ultimately more satisfying than the nice guy alternative. The challenge of maintaining progress when you're surrounded by people who prefer you as a nice guy is significant and requires ongoing vigilance. Some people in your life have benefited from your self-suppression, whether consciously or unconsciously, and they will resist your transformation because it's less convenient for them when you have boundaries and express genuine preferences. These people will use guilt, obligation, and appeals to your past behavior to try to pull you back into old patterns. You might hear things like, "You used to be so easygoing, what happened to you?" Or "You've changed and not in a good way," or "I liked you better before." These statements are attempts at manipulation, efforts to restore the dynamic where you suppressed yourself for others' comfort, and you must learn to recognize them as such without letting them derail your progress. The Stoic response is to recognize that you cannot control others' preferences about who you should be. You can only control whether you maintain your commitment to authenticity. When someone expresses disappointment that you're no longer endlessly accommodating, you can acknowledge their feeling without making it your responsibility to fix. "I understand this change is uncomfortable for you, and I'm committed to being more authentic in how I show up, even though that means I'll sometimes disappoint people." Let's address the specific fear that drives much of the nice guy pattern, the fear that if you are authentically yourself, you will be fundamentally alone because no one will accept or love your genuine self. This is a profound existential fear, and it cannot be reasoned away through logic alone. The only way to truly address this fear is through experiential evidence, through the accumulation of moments where you were authentic and were accepted, where you expressed genuine preferences and were not abandoned, where you set boundaries and the relationship survived or even strengthened. Each time you take the risk of authenticity and survive the outcome, whether that outcome is acceptance or rejection, you build evidence against the fear. If you're accepted, you learn that authentic connection is possible. If you're rejected, you learn that rejection is survivable and that you're more resilient than you believed. Both outcomes move you forward. The Stoic philosophers understood that fear of future evils is often more painful than the evils themselves, that our imagination of catastrophe is usually worse than the reality, and that by directly confronting what we fear, we rob it of its power over us. The nice guy is living in constant fear of rejection, contorting himself endlessly to avoid it, but this avoidance guarantees a different kind of rejection, self-rejection. Better to risk external rejection in pursuit of authentic connection than to guarantee internal alienation through perpetual self-suppression. The integration of these philosophical principles with modern therapeutic approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy creates a powerful framework for transformation. ACT emphasizes the importance of identifying your core values and then taking committed action in alignment with those values even in the presence of discomfort or fear. When you combine this with Stoic philosophy, you get a comprehensive approach. Use the Stoic dichotomy of control to clarify what is genuinely within your power. Use the cardinal virtues to identify what truly matters to you, and then take committed action toward living according to those values, regardless of the discomfort this creates or the outcomes it produces. The nice guy has been living according to the value of approval seeking, which is not actually a value, but a strategy, and it's a strategy that doesn't work. When you shift to living according to authentic values like integrity, courage, authentic connection, and self-respect, your actions change dramatically because you're no longer optimizing for others' comfort, but for your own sense of living well. The practical work of developing self-compassion alongside the rigorous self-examination that Stoicism requires is essential because many men who are trying to break the nice guy pattern fall into harsh self-criticism when they notice themselves falling back into old behaviors. You must learn to hold yourself accountable while also being compassionate about the difficulty of changing deeply ingrained patterns. The Stoics were not about self-flagellation, but about clear-eyed assessment of where you are and committed effort to improve. When you notice yourself falling back into people-pleasing, the response should not be, "I'm terrible, I'll never change, what's wrong with me?" The response should be, "I notice I just suppressed my genuine opinion out of fear of rejection. Let me understand what triggered that fear and what I can do differently next time." This is self-compassion combined with accountability, recognizing that change is difficult while still holding yourself to the standard of your values. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should be like a boxer who gets knocked down and gets back up, not like a dancer who must perform perfectly every time. You will get knocked down repeatedly in this work. You will fall back into old patterns, and the measure of your progress is how quickly you get back up and recommit to your practice. The question of whether you can maintain close relationships with people who knew you as a nice guy and who resist your transformation is complex and requires individual assessment. Some relationships have enough foundation of genuine mutual regard that they can weather the disruption of your changing behavior, while others are so deeply based on your self-suppression that they cannot survive your authenticity. You cannot know which category a particular relationship falls into until you test it by maintaining your boundaries and authentic expression despite resistance. Give people time to adjust to the new dynamic, recognizing that initial resistance doesn't necessarily mean the relationship is doomed. But if after sustained effort someone continues to guilt you, manipulate you, or refuse to respect your boundaries, you need to be willing to release that relationship or significantly limit your involvement in it. This is one of the most painful aspects of breaking the nice guy pattern, particularly when it involves family relationships where complete disconnection may not be possible or desirable. In these cases, you may need to establish very clear boundaries about what you will and won't engage with, limiting contact or keeping interaction superficial while maintaining your commitment to not falling back into self-suppression. The Stoic conception of the cosmopolis, the universal city of rational beings, provides a useful perspective on your place in the human community as you break free from the nice guy pattern. The Stoics taught that we are all part of a larger whole, that we have duties to each other arising from our common rational nature, and that the flourishing of the whole depends on each individual fulfilling their particular role with virtue. When you understand yourself as part of this larger cosmopolis, you recognize that your transformation is not just about your individual well-being, but about your contribution to the collective. Every man who breaks free from the nice guy pattern and models authentic masculinity makes it easier for other men to do the same. Every time you set a healthy boundary, you give permission to others to do likewise. Every time you express authentic emotion appropriately, you challenge the cultural narrative that emotional suppression is strength. Your individual development has ripple effects beyond what you can see, and this provides additional motivation to do the difficult work of transformation. You are not just doing this for yourself, but as part of your duty to the larger human community to be the best version of yourself you can be. The practical question of how to handle the inevitable relapses and setbacks in this journey requires a strategy developed in advance, so you're not making decisions in the midst of discouragement. You will have days or even weeks where you fall completely back into the nice guy pattern, where old fears overwhelm you and you suppress yourself automatically without even noticing until later. When this happens, you need a protocol for getting back on track. First, notice the relapse without catastrophizing it. Second, identify what triggered the relapse, what fear or circumstance pulled you back into old patterns. Third, recommit to your values and to the practices that support authenticity. And fourth, take one small action that day that expresses your authentic self, even if it's as simple as expressing a genuine preference about where to eat lunch. The key is to prevent a temporary setback from becoming a permanent regression by taking action quickly to redirect yourself. The Stoics understood that virtue is not a state you achieve once and then possess forever, but rather a practice that requires constant cultivation. And this means that setbacks are not failures, but simply part of the ongoing process of development. As you near the completion of this journey from frustrated nice guy to authentic man, it's important to recognize that you are not moving toward some final state of perfection, but rather toward an ongoing practice of authentic engagement with life. You will never reach a point where authenticity is easy, or where you never feel the pull to suppress yourself for approval. What changes is your relationship to these impulses and your capacity to choose differently despite them. You develop what might be called resilience of authenticity, the ability to maintain your genuine self-expression, even in the face of resistance or rejection. And this resilience comes from the accumulated evidence that authenticity is survivable and ultimately more satisfying than self-suppression. The Stoic ideal is not to eliminate all discomfort or to reach a state where you never struggle, but rather to develop the wisdom and courage to navigate struggle without abandoning your principles. This is the mark of a developed character, and it is the only reliable source of lasting fulfillment. You stand now at a threshold, aware of the prison you've been living in and capable of walking out of it if you choose. The frustrated nice guy cycle is not something that happens to you, but something you are actively choosing in each moment when you suppress your authentic self in hopes of earning approval. You can choose differently, starting with the very next interaction you have. You can choose to express a genuine preference, to disagree when you actually disagree, to say no to a request that doesn't serve you, to ask for what you need, to set a boundary that protects your well-being. Each of these choices will be difficult at first, will trigger anxiety and doubt, will risk the rejection you've been trying so hard to avoid. But each choice will also build your capacity for authentic living, will strengthen your self-respect, will move you incrementally toward the integrated masculinity that will actually fulfill you. The Stoics teach us that we always have the power to choose our response to circumstances, that this power of choice is our essential freedom and our highest dignity as human beings. The circumstances of your past conditioning do not determine your future trajectory. Your habits of self-suppression do not define who you must be going forward. At any moment, you can choose to live according to your values rather than your fears, to prioritize integrity over approval, to be authentic rather than nice. This choice is available to you now, and it will be available to you in every moment for the rest of your life. The question is not whether you can change, but whether you will, whether you have the courage to step into the discomfort of authenticity rather than remaining in the familiar suffering of the nice guy pattern. The philosophical journey you have begun by even reading this far is already a declaration of intention, an acknowledgement that something must change. Honor that intention by taking action, however small, today. The Stoics insisted that philosophy is not merely theoretical understanding, but practical wisdom that must be applied, and this application is where transformation happens. Read these words not as information to be passively consumed, but as a call to action that requires your response. Your life is finite, your time limited, your potential waiting to be actualized. The nice guy pattern is a slow death of the spirit, a gradual erosion of your authentic self in service of a strategy that cannot deliver what you truly need. You deserve better than this half-life of suppression and performance. You deserve the risk and reward of showing up as you genuinely are, of building connections based on authentic mutual regard rather than on strategic self-presentation, of living with the integrity that comes from alignment between your inner experience and outer expression. This is not easy work, but it is necessary work if you want a life you won't regret. The ancient Stoic philosophers understood something that modern culture has forgotten, that the only lasting satisfaction comes from living according to virtue, from being able to look at yourself with honest self-respect, from knowing that you are choosing courage over comfort and authenticity over approval. This is the path forward from the frustrated nice guy cycle, not toward perfection, but toward genuine flourishing, not toward a life free of struggle, but toward struggle that has meaning and purpose. The choice is yours, moment by moment, interaction by interaction, for the rest of your life. Choose wisely, choose courageously, choose authentically. Your genuine self is waiting to be expressed, and the world needs men who have the courage to be real rather than nice, who can offer authentic strength rather than strategic agreeability, who demonstrate that masculinity can integrate both power and tenderness without sacrificing either. Begin today. Begin now. Begin with the very next choice you make. That is where transformation lives. Not in some distant future where conditions will be perfect, but in this moment where you have the power to choose differently than you have before. And so we conclude another reflection. If you enjoyed it and want to continue receiving life-changing reflections like this one, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. And tell me in the comments, did this story touch you in any way? Did it remind you of something in your life? Share it with us, because your experiences need to be told and heard. Thank you so much for being here and being part of this community that grows every day. You are very important. Until our next meeting,